ideological measuring sticks don't
Hmm.
quite capture the rise of independence.
Hmm.
You can use them and they can teach you something, but there's something more that's more about lack of trust. I don't want to be part of these institutions.
Yes, and this is what drives me nuts in how parties view independence. They assume they're all these center left and center right people
Right.
when they're not. They're not a member of a political party because they're not a member of a political party.
I want to talk to you about the reform movement.
Our small d democracy needs an infrastructure improvement. It's,
Yes.
by the way, we've done it for decades. It just, we haven't done it in 60 years, 70
Right.
years, 80 years, but we used to do it all the time.
I know.
We would sort of, we would shift the democracy based on our new population or our new geographic demands or whatever it is.
It was part of the routine activity of building America.
Right.
And it's now there is kind of a little bit of like, okay, we got this. This is the status quo.
Like the biggest impediment to some of this structural reform are the two political parties themselves.
Yep.
Because in one state or another, they're afraid of a reform that might hurt them short term. You want to get at an 80% whole question agreement on? It's simply saying, is a two-party system been good for America or bad for America?
How do we rebuild trust that isn't nostalgic, that isn't looking backwards, but that is innovative and looking forward? How do you think about that?
You don't build trust, you earn trust.
Welcome, everybody. It's great to see all of you today in the middle of the day. I'm really excited to have this conversation today with Chuck Todd. Chuck, as I'm sure all of you know, has been a mainstay at NBC News for almost 2 decades as chief political analyst, the host of Meet the Press, the host of Meet the Press Now, and the host of the Chuck Toddcast, which I think gets the award for the most elegant podcast name out there. He's also been an outspoken advocate for political and journalistic reform and innovation. So thank you, Chuck. Thanks for joining us today.
No, happy to do it. And look, we're in a period where I think we'll look back and say, oh, this turned out to be a renaissance of reform. But we'll see.
I hope so. And
Um,
I want to talk to you about that. I know you've
mhm.
been I've heard you a number of times now talk about similarities between this era and the early 20th century and the kind of the
Mhm.
progressive movement. But let me start by saying I've been a fan for about your whole career.
Well, thank you for
Not just
saying.
because you're a good journalist, though that's true. You're a very good journalist. But one of the things that was very noticeable about you, and I'm talking going back decades, is that, and in fact, I edited a book in 2010 called Talk, and you can see yourself right there on the
Okay.
cover.
Yeah,
This
I
is
see that.
an illustration by the great political cartoonist Alice Rydell. But this was a book my colleagues Fred Newman and Jackie Salett would watch the Sunday morning talk shows and then talk
Mhm.
about them. And I edited this. And one of the things that was really interesting about you as a journalist is that you seem to be sensitive to and interested in the rise of independent voters. You found ways to
Mhm.
bring in independence at a time when most journalists really were ignoring the trend. So what do
Mm.
you make of that? What's your sensibilities towards this independence? And I'm talking over the last 20 years.
Well, I have a bias towards focusing on the voters that decide elections, right? I
Hmm.
mean, I don't mean to be that sort of I don't want to say it's cynical, but it's sort of like why? Because they're the deciders, right?
Right.
You want to sort of narrow in on it. Why do we only focus on 7 or 8 states, right? They decide who wins elections. So in that sense, look, over the last 10 years, if you give me the results of a survey just through the prism of self-described independence, and that's an important point here because who you include in your pool of independence is actually a bit of a social science debate. We can talk about that in a minute.
Yes.
But we had the NBC News poll, and when I say that, it was myself plus the two pollsters, where we would and Mark Murray and myself and the two pollsters, we would make these decisions, and we had a very hard definition of independent. We asked people if they were independent but leaned one way, and then we wouldn't include those folks in independent. So it's 13%. And I say it's 13, it is shockingly consistent, but it's somewhere in the very, very low teens of people that are pure independents who don't say they lean one way or the other. And what's remarkable is that when you look at any question, public policy question, or sentiment question, it's shocking how the overall response and the response just among independents usually mirror each other, right? And so the people that are self-described independents truly end up being the microcosm of where a story is headed, right? Or where a position is. For instance, you knew the border was a benefit to the right because independents look more like Republicans on border issues than they did independents or Democrats. On some of these social issues, those same independents look more like Democrats than they did. The point is that I'm a data-driven guy. And so when you're asking why the focus on independence, well, when you look at it, first of all, independents can be more, they're persuadable. And independent voters are not necessarily expecting to be to get 100% their way, right? In some ways, they already know this, so they're making the decision of somewhat of a transactional decision, I think, most of the time, of what they care about the most and which party can get them there in that direction. So in that sense, that's why I've always focused on independence. But if you look, the fastest growing political party in America is no party, right? It's people leaving a major party and joining independence. And we're seeing that phenomenon again, right? Whenever one party loses and is unpopular, all of a sudden you'll see their overall registration numbers dip a little bit. And then all of a sudden you're like, well, did Democrats disappear? No, those Democratic leaning voters are just registering as independents right now. They'll probably end up voting like Democrats, which is why you've got to be careful in who you include in your pool of independents. You'll see some surveys that claim there's 30 to 40% of people are independent. I think 30 or 40% of people want to be classified as independent. But when you dig in, you find out that about 70% of them actually lean one way or the other. And
Well,
it's that 30% of independents, which turns out to about 13% of the overall electorate, that are the true sort of sitting in between the 48-yard lines, if you will, if I'm going to use the football gridiron as a marking tool here. I lean on sports metaphors probably too often, so my apologies for those that hate them in advance.
We love metaphors.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because, and again, this is just a personal impression, is that I think a lot of pundits and analysts use you can always ask that follow-up question of independence, where do you lean, as a way to say there really are no independents. You used it differently, is to say, I want to talk to the most concentrated independents to get at the heart of the story without dismissing the fact that there is this trend. But I mean, the mainstream position on independence, and this is now changing, was that they don't exist at all. You can just reclassify them as partisans, light partisans, out of existence, and then you don't have to deal with the fact that 10,000 people a day are leaving the parties.
Well, I guess I would say that this way. I think the party leaders, it's in their best interests not to have independence, right? Because they almost want the bases to be considered more powerful than the middle.
Right.
So it is a little bit of a fight inside parties, right?
Yep.
Where you have look, you have, I would say right now, the center right is in retreat in the Republican side, right? And the populist side the nationalist side is on the march. And I think right now it's an open question about the direction of where the Democrats are headed here a little bit. But I think, I do think the leadership of both parties, in some ways, politics is a lot easier if it's binary, right? And politics is a lot easier if it's about getting out your base rather than persuading, right? And my biggest beef with American politics in the 21st century is that we stopped persuading. I've often joked that the worst thing to happen to political campaigns was more information about undecided voters. What do I mean by this?
Hmm.
In the 70s, 80s, and 90s, before big data, before micro targeting,
Right.
there was an assumption among political strategists on both sides of the aisle that we lived in a 40-40-20 world. 40% Democrat, 40% Republican, and 20 in the middle decided things. And this mythical 20%, each side believed was some sort of centrist or moderate, or certainly not.
Yes.
Okay. And they were reported that way. What do I mean? So in October of an election year before 2004, and 2004 is the year that this all changed. It's the
Big data.
year
Right.
we
Right.
found out about big data in politics. But before we had that information, both parties conducted campaigns assuming they had to persuade that the last undecided voters were all non-party members, and they had to be persuaded from the center out. So, for instance, as a kid, I used to say, even in the 90s, a generic Senate ad from a Republican incumbent in October, that incumbent would brag about the Democrat they worked with to get some bill passed because they assumed they were courting a middle of the road voter. Ditto, that the Democratic incumbent senator ran sort of the identical ad bragging about the Republican they worked with to get some bill passed.
Right.
Because again, and then big data told us, oh no, that 20% are not moderates and centrists. Some of them are further to the right or the left than some of your parties. And then we got it, and the more information we learned about these swingish voters, the more you saw political messaging become more micro-targeted. And what did it do? Instead of trying to persuade people to come to your side, we flipped the script. And because we knew all this information about the voter, the politician decided they want to make the case that they're on your side.
Mm.
And in no longer persuading the voter to compromise, right? I always say, look, we invented politics to settle disputes without violence.
Right.
Right. We should realize that there's not a single person we vote for, unless it's yourself, that you're going to agree with 100% of the time. And yet we create this sort of all or nothing mindset these days in the two parties, when at the end of the day, you're electing people to govern 350 million people. Don't move quickly. If you want to keep 350 million people moving in the same direction, you better move methodically and slowly. But I do think that big data took us out of the persuasion game.
Yeah.
And we just don't have any politicians that know how to persuade anymore. They don't even do it. You don't have to.
That's so fascinating.
Right? Data has told you that instead you can get your party base to come with you on one hand, and then you just find 3 issues that you agree with undecided voters on, and you sort of try to virtue signal to them. But nobody's making an argument anymore, and here we are.
It also seems like one of the disconnects I experience, and this is more from the activity of organizing voters, including independents, around open primaries, is that ideological measuring sticks don't quite capture the rise of independence. You can use them and they can teach you something, but there's something more that's more about lack of trust. I don't want to be part of these institutions.
See, yes. And this is what drives me nuts in how parties view independence. They assume they're all these center left and center right people.
Right.
When they're not. They're not a member of a political party because they're not a member of a political party. Right. They don't want to be a member of that group. But they're arguably more open-minded, right? But they want a more rigorous they in some ways, I would argue, independents are a bit more skeptical. I always said I was that I viewed my job at Meet the Press as to be a professional skeptic. Even if I wasn't personally skeptical of an idea, my job was to always behave skeptically because I want to workshop the idea. I want you to make your case to me. Tell me why this is going to work. Um, and I do think that this is the, look, when you lose nuance and when all media becomes partisan, right? Either team red or team blue, nuance is the first thing that disappears.
I want to talk to you about the media, but before we do that, I want to talk to you
Mhm.
about the reform movement because you've written
Mhm.
a lot. You've been interested in reform your whole career. My experience is that
Well,
there's
we
been
need new
a
roads and bridges. Well, guess what else needs our what other
yeah,
infrastructure needs improving? Our small d democracy needs an infrastructure improvement. It's,
yes,
by the way, the exact we've been in and we've done it for decades. It just we haven't done it in 60 years, 70
right.
years, 80 years, but we used to do it all the time.
I
We'd
know.
let we would sort of we would shift the democracy based on our new population or our new geographic demands or whatever it is. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
No, no, it was part of the routine activity of building America.
Right.
And it's now there is kind of a little bit of like, okay, we got this. This is the status quo. But there is a movement. I mean, the people on this Zoom call are all part in different ways of
Hmm.
and one thing I've experienced is that there's been a kind of a paradigm shift about what reform is. That it's
Hmm.
migrated from essentially regulatory, like ethics, lobbying, campaign
Yeah.
finance, to more, hey, the actual structures of our democracy have been hijacked by these political parties, and we have to untangle that. Am I overstating it? Do you see, has there been a shift that you
I
see?
don't know yet. I hope
We don't know
so.
yet.
I meaning like other than a little bit of movement on ranked choice voting, you know, top two in California, which was a reform that's now almost 20 years old, actually,
Right.
believe it or not, when Arnold put that in. Um, we haven't done a lot. So I'm with you there. I certainly look, I believe that the biggest reforms we need are structural when it comes to electoral, right? Whether it's primaries, how should they work? Do we even bother with party primaries anymore? Um, I certainly think that there's got to be a better way than what we're doing now. You can't continue to have a minority of a minority population decide who the contestants are for a general election, right? And we can sit here and say, well, people need to be more mindful of when their primary elections are. Please, it's all over the map, and we're a transient population. I actually think just the reverse. It is on government should make it more convenient, not less convenient to
Right.
participate. So it's our democracy. It doesn't belong to the duopoly, and it is a duopoly, right? Like the biggest impediment to some of this structural reform are the two political parties themselves.
Yep.
Because in one state or another, they're afraid of a reform that might hurt them short term,
Totally.
right? In state X, right? Versus state Y and stuff like this. So I I agree that there is more interest among activists like your group here in some structural reforms that that are outside of Washington, right? But I'd like to see them take hold. I
Yeah.
don't know.
No, I think we're
I
still
mean,
in
we haven't
early
had enough.
days.
Yeah, we're
Yeah.
very early. But I do, and you brought it up sooner. I mean, if you look at the last time we were sort of in this very polarized environment, which is before World War I, after Reconstruction, that period, the rise of the robber barons, we were having this industrialized economy, moving from an agrarian to an industrial. We made a lot of political reforms at the same time that we were making reforms to our society, whether it's giving women the right to vote, direct election to senators, prohibition, which we realized was a mistake. But the point is that that was also part of a political reform movement
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
well. It just one that failed, right? Not every reform movement's a good one. Um, and so we're in the middle of something right now, and it may be 20 or 30 years long. I mean, that's the other thing we have to give ourselves. Sometimes I think as a country, we don't give ourselves enough grace. I mean, I think about the following fact a lot is I'm 3 years removed from going to segregated public
Yeah.
schools in
Yeah.
Florida. Okay. My mother was raised in segregated America and she's still alive. There's a lot of people in America that lived in America when it wasn't a multiracial democracy.
Yeah.
So we've made a lot of progress in 55 years, but we have a lot of work to do as well.
No, I mean, I grew up in a liberal suburb of Chicago, and the year I was born, 1969,
Mm-hmm.
Evanston, Illinois, still had segregated beaches. Like, okay, you know. You interviewed Nick Troiano
Hmm.
earlier this year or last year,
Hmm.
and one of the things, it was a great interview. Everyone should go back to the Chuck podcast of March of last year and listen to this interview.
Thank you.
It's really good. But one of the I wanted you to elaborate on this because you talked
Hmm.
about that reform needs to there needs to be some tension
Hmm.
between new ideas, new structures, and new systems with bringing the American people along, and they have
Right.
to be durable. You can't
Yeah.
just, and that's a very healthy tension. Do you think we're doing that well in these early days of this movement, or are we is there too much of a gulf between average voters and the reform movement? What does that look like to you right now?
Well, specifically, I'd focus on ranked choice voting. What the idea of ranked choice voting, I love. Um, Try explaining round one results to round two results to round three results when you're on TV, and you're trying to the average voter who um, knows that they showed up to vote. Okay, I get it. I rank, but then you're like, okay, I'm not sure who's on top. Can you tell me why so and so, why the second place candidate won? Yeah, I know the rules, but can you show me? It's really hard to show the work. And I do
Yeah,
think in America, you got to show your work,
yeah,
especially in this environment of distrust. I mean, this is a really frustrating period. Take the issue of big tech. There's about 70 to 80% of the country that agrees big tech needs to be regulated.
right.
But the problem is half of those people don't trust the left to regulate big tech, and the other half doesn't trust the right to regulate big tech, right? Ideally, we need a bipartisan commission, or we need some sort of healthy left right, but we don't have a healthy left right now.
No, we don't.
It's an unhealthy political ecosystem in the moment. So it's sort of like I if you have to if a reform isn't obvious to somebody in the moment, then you should move on. I hate to say it that way. Like
No,
I
that's
do think
interesting. That's interesting.
it's gotta be easy to explain at the dog park,
Right.
right? Not just easy to explain in a civics class
Yeah.
or at a town meeting. And you kind of and this is where, you know, look, I'm for I want to accomplish what ranked choice voting accomplishes. I think the better system is California is the pure top two, everybody in one ballot, top two. It feels like the best of all of the like none of them are perfect. I think we're a four-party country shoved into a two-party system.
Yeah.
I actually, in that sense, meaning that if we had take the 2016 election, I think we very much could have had a European style four-party, think France, where Bernie Sanders is the Green Party, the center left party is Hillary, the center right party is, say, Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush, and the Nationalist Party is Donald Trump. And you know, all four on the national ballot, top two face off in a runoff, right?
Right.
That would have felt like, and I'm actually a believer that in the way our system works, I understand why our founders said no to a parliamentary system. It turned out to be a mistake because the what a parliamentary system usually can teach a young democracy is how to compromise. If
Hmm.
you have to compromise to get power, then you are more willing to compromise when you enact power.
Right.
If you don't have to compromise to get power, you're not going to compromise to enact power.
Yeah.
Don't believe me? Just look at the House of Representatives,
Right.
right? If you don't think if any way that we can get to a situation where there has to be a compromise to get power, I think creates a healthier political environment
That's
for
that's
for a small d democracy.
yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Let's and then I'm going to open it up in just a few minutes, but I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
talk to you about trust because I know you're very big on
Mm-hmm.
the journalistic world needing to rebuild trust at the local level.
Mm-hmm.
But you look at, I mean, churches, the
Yeah.
political parties, the legacy media. I mean, Jonathan Rauch, he's a Jewish atheist. just wrote a book lamenting the fact that church going has dropped 50% in the last 20 years and the
Yeah.
effect on our democracy.
Yeah.
But here's my philosophical question for you. How do we rebuild trust that isn't nostalgic, that isn't looking
Right.
backwards, but that is innovative and looking forward? How do you think about that?
You don't build trust, you earn trust.
You earn it, right?
Right? So you've got to figure out this isn't something that's going to happen overnight, right? I view the best place I can make a contribution to this is to try to improve the information ecosystem. I have determined that the biggest problem, I already outlined why big tech can't get regulated, even if it should be. I'm not going to sit here and say it shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
We're not a politically healthy enough place to do it. It doesn't mean we might not get there, and that maybe political movement becomes healthy enough to get critical mass to do it. But I worry about the loss of a moral code that religion gives us. Like if you don't learn a moral code growing up in a religious community, where else are you going to get your moral code from? And I say this as somebody who also sort of shares. Look, I'm a sometimes practicing Jew. I say that in that uh, my kids went to Hebrew school. I believed in them getting a religious education because if you want to understand how the world works, you got to understand religion.
Yeah, right.
And in fact, I don't think we teach religion correctly in schools.
Mm.
We're so worried about the separation of church and state that we actually don't teach things like the history of religion. Like, I can't understand the politics of a place if I don't know about the local religion, the local economy, and the local demography. That's it. Give me those three things, and then I'll be able to understand the politics of any part of the world. But you need to know those three things in order to understand sort of how a certain community thinks or votes or behaves. So I do think trust is earned. And, look, the problem we have is we have too much power, perceived power, and wrapped up in Washington.
Yeah.
I joke in the journalism world, there's too many journalists in Washington and not enough everywhere else, right? There's too much, the attention economy is all caught up in DC a little bit. And then you have this perception that we have decided that the president has to be representative of America in any given moment. That it's somehow we somehow we project all these things onto the presidency now that our founders didn't want, right? What's weird is we the whole point of the executive branch was to be a facilitator of the laws that are passed by the legislative branch, right? Be sort of the administrator and facilitator, and yes, on foreign policy, but we have over empowered the executive over the last 30 years. We've weakened Congress. And that to me is the biggest, like if the founders came back to life today, that would be their number one. You did what? First of all, they'd say, why is Congress so small? You're
Yes.
350 million people.
Right.
And you now have one person per million, basically. Well, not quite per million, about one per 800,000. This is one of my hobby horse, the only hobby horse in the small d democratic reform movement that I'm obsessed with, that I think are anything that can be done without a constitutional amendment. And I think uncapping the House, doubling the size of the House, moving to a ratio of 1 per 400,000, which, by the way, the 50th largest city in America is Arlington, Texas. And they have a population of about 400,000. That's a community of interest that probably deserves one member of Congress in Washington. Arlington, Texas is a suburb of Dallas. So I think that's a pretty good mark. And if we went to 1 per 400, we'd be at about 800 members right now. You would also solve two problems that drive probably a lot of people crazy on this Zoom call. One is the Electoral College math would double. And what does that mean? The likelihood of a split decision between the Electoral College and the popular vote literally goes down to infinitesimal.
Right. That's
okay, number. and I'll give you the easy way out of this. So in my math here, doing that quick math I did, California would have 99 electoral votes under this. Wyoming would still only have 3. Wyoming would still have more voting power for president than a California resident, but instead of 6 times the voting
It'd
power,
be 3 times, right?
it would be 2.5 to,
Right,
it's
right,
about a
right.
little under 3 times. So it's still, it basically still sort of puts a nod to the founders, like, hey, don't mush the small states.
Yeah.
Give them let them punch above their weight, but they're not supposed to run the whole
They're not
goddamn
supposed to run the
place,
country,
right?
right?
So, and oh, by the way, you would also eliminate the need for gerrymander. I'm not saying it disappears, okay, but it becomes less necessary if you're shrinking these. And I think, look, the upside of this idea is simply having your member of Congress be closer to the people they represent.
Which
And I
was
think
the
right now,
original design.
which
That
was
was
the
what
original
Congress was supposed to
design.
be. Yeah.
And right now, at 1 per 800, there is no individual community that thinks the same. No single group of 800,000 people that thinks that
Right.
way. So I think it's outgrown these congressional districts. And I know people think, Jesus, 800 members of Congress. Yeah, you're going to get all sorts of species from this ocean, but that's America. And it probably means there would be more likely somebody in Congress that represents people on this call than what we have today.
Yeah, that would be that's right. One last thing before we open it up. I know you spoke at the Reed Boehner event a couple years ago about
Mm-hmm.
your interest in getting rid of partisan voter registration.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask you, like, have you thought about that recently? What brought that to your attention, or what makes you think about that?
Well, look, I just think that look, I have the luxury of living in the state of Virginia, which is no party registration.
Right.
And there are times that the more competitive primary is in the Republican side for an office, and sometimes it's on the Democratic side. So, I have always believed in a democracy just because I might not support the whole point, the way I thought politics worked, I may not support a piece of legislation that's going to pass if I'm a member of Congress, but if it's going to pass, I want it to be as beneficial to my community as I can make it. So I feel the same way about voting. So maybe my side doesn't have a competitive primary, but if the other side is the one that's going to win, I want to have a say in who they pick and who gets nominated on that side. So I just think that if we got away from party registration completely, right, and it was just voter registration, and you decided on a given day, on a given election year, okay, you can't, I'm going to take a Democratic primary ballot this time. I'm going to take a Republican primary ballot this time. I think you'd get more participation, right, than making people pick a team and then they assume, it's like any group. Well, I'm not a member of that group. Should I really? I'm not saying people should think this way, but I know people do think this way. Well, that's up to the Democrats who they decide. I'm not a Democrat. And you're like, no, you're an American citizen. So it is up to you. You're eventually may have to, don't you want to say in who the choices are? So look, I certainly would love to see party registration disappear, because I have felt like a more empowered voter in Virginia.
Yeah.
I have felt like I have had more, now that said, I wasn't when I lived in the district for periods of time, I never registered as a Democrat, in part out of journalism. Remember, I registered for some third party and I felt like I had no vote whatsoever. And, and part of that is, as a journalist, because people will take your party registration, which does become public, and then try to ascribe, and so I'm trying to be the best I can be about, I'm transparent about everywhere I've worked and transparent about where I live and all of those things. And, I always say most people don't know my politics. They assume they know my politics based on other people I share a stage with or a network I work at. But ultimately, I always say, no, I don't share my politics. I just always begin from the middle out. And why do I begin from the middle out? Because all solutions in politics start from the middle out. Right. They just is. If you want legislation that has staying power in America, it's usually the ones that begin from the middle out.
Right. All right, let's open things up here. I want to go to Mike Kennig in Georgia, who has a question about educating the mass media. Go ahead, Mike.
Hi, Chuck. Mike Kennig from Georgia's
Hey.
big fan. Really appreciate your comments. Especially echo your comment about the getting rid of partisan voter registration. And I think a good number of people on this call, in addition to the ranked choice voting, also believe that having partisan primaries is also part of the problem, and doing the combined primary, like you said, in California. I think a lot of people on this call might say that they like Alaska better than California
Yeah.
because they like the 4 versus the 2, and there's a lot of discussion, debate about that. But the question I have for you is, you've been great. You've had people like John and Nick Toronto, and
Mhm.
you've listened to them, and you've learned, and you've been able to form your own thoughts. How can we get more in the media to just get to that place of understanding, what are the opportunities with and challenges with partisan primaries, so that they can then, because frankly, even mass media folks that have had people like John or Nick on their programs,
Yeah.
in future discussions, the obvious opportunity to interject at least a mention of that or a reference to that,
Yeah.
they miss it, and they fall right back into the regular routine.
I wish I had a good answer, but I don't know. First of all, it's hard to, what is mass media anymore? Joe Rogan gets right 5 million viewers. He's getting the same as Lester Holt. So is that mass media, right? Like so I always wonder, like, what are we defining here? I do think part of the problem is in the so-called larger media spaces is that New York and DC are so uncompetitive places, I guess. I would hope that the Virginia experience that I have, which bleeds into the DC media market, um, would be more telling. But you're not wrong. I mean, first of all, I'm one of the few reporters that lives in Virginia. Almost everybody lives in DC or New York, or you have some that live in. Frankly, in the reporting world, more people are more likely to live in Chevy Chase, Maryland, than they are in Arlington, Virginia. It is it 30 years ago in DC, Maryland was considered the Democratic side and Virginia was considered the Republican side.
Hmm.
Of course, then all of a sudden Virginia had a Democratic governor and Maryland a Republican governor, right? It really is, it turns out what you really have is the DMV is its own thing, right? And I want, but I often wonder if the lack of experience with nonpartisan voting, the lack of experience in swing states, particularly in New York, where you really don't have any in New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, right? There's a handful of people that commute from Pennsylvania, right? So they at least have some of this idea. I don't know if that is part of the reason why it has a hard time penetrating the average reporter on this, and why it's not infused more in coverage. But you know, it's a choice. If I sit there, I look at how everybody's focusing on. Take the most two recent polls that came out from CNN and NBC over the weekend. There was a narrative shift that everybody look at how unpopular Democrats are among Democrats. Okay. But there were
Huh.
a lot of other interesting numbers in there too, among, where did those Democratic voters go? Where, hey, guess what? Independents don't like Trump either. We have this weird, it's a choice about what you focus on. And if reporters wanted to focus on the lack of the fact that there are people that feel like neither party is really talking to them, um, other than right around election time when we'll gather together a focus group for television in the suburbs of Phoenix, we there it isn't a natural way for us for I guess what you're describing as mass media, for them a posture to be. Frankly, I think if we're going to be in this sort of partisan media environment where you're going to get your blue news from these channels and your red news from these channels, I guess you have to hope that there's some more independent media, and that there are more people, whether it's myself, whether it's Michael Schmerkanish, and hope that more of those folks get a following, or you get, I'm not going to sit here and I've got my beefs with Joe Rogan, but I think he's a guy you could persuade on these things. And who knows, you might be able to get a guy like that to suddenly sign up for, yeah, why do we have partisan registration?
We're trying.
You know? So, I guess I would be in the never stop trying to persuade, never give up. But I do think there's a geographic disadvantage just to how people experience politics themselves in New York and Washington that may contribute to the lack of inserting that issue into the conversation more.
All right, thanks, Mike. I want to go to Austin Campbell, who worked on Dan Osborne's campaign in Nebraska, and he has some questions about independent candidates. Go ahead, Austin.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, thanks, John. Hi, Chuck. Yeah, we worked on the Dan Osborne campaign out in Nebraska, and it's funny when you were talking about kind of how the political ideological divide right now used to be people thought independents were in the center and everyone was trying to convince them to go outwards. But realistically, throughout the ideologues on left or right, they're kind of like piecemealed in. They're just like the non-party affiliated. So for election or for political innovation to happen, do you kind of think it's election reform, like the systemic problems that we have, or is it the candidates and the viability show voters what is possible outside the two-party system? What do you think kind of comes first?
I think it's the infrastructure. I think you have an infrastructure that allows for Dan Osborne's of the world to run. You'll get more Dan Osborne's to run, right? The barrier to entry for independent candidates, the barrier to entry to start a third or a fourth party in a given state is absurdly high in so many places, right? Whether it's gathering, you'll get these like, boy, the state of Michigan has like, you not only have to gather a certain amount of petition signatures, but you better have a certain amount of petition signatures in this congressional district and that one, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like these extra barriers if you're not affiliated with one of the two major parties. So I do think this is the question. If you build it, they will come. I think if it was easier for people to run as independents, if it was easier to gain ballot access to run as a Green Party candidate or a Conservative Party candidate or Working Families Party, right? You name it. You'd have more of those candidates because, just look at what we learned out of the Nebraska race. I find the Osborne candidacy interesting because what would have happened if he put a D next to his name? What do you think would have happened?
I think you lose Republicans. I think people are so partisan.
You probably lost 10. You probably lost 5 to 10 points, right?
Yeah.
Instead of being at 40, what was he, 44, 45?
Yeah, we lost by 6 points.
Right. It was so it gets into this interesting, we have an interesting dilemma that the Democrats have, which is there's a majority coalition against Trumpism in this country in probably about 35 states. But there's not trust in the Democratic Party as the vehicle to be the anti-Trump or to be the alternative. I don't even want to call it anti-Trump, really the alternative to this. And this is something that has to be wrestled with, right? I've been studying the Israeli Labor Party because I've often joked, is Israel's, did we export our politics to Israel or is Israel exporting its politics to us? Right. And I've been obsessed with, when Bibi first won, the Labor Party was the strongest left-wing party in Israel. Mm-hmm. When they all of a sudden it collapsed. And then what you had was these forces of just anti-Bibi coalition. And they have succeeded in that they've always found a coalition that can be competitive. And Bibi just moves further to the right, right? He's the most liberal member of his coalition, which is always funny to say. But I think about that in wondering what's going to happen here. I'm mostly convinced the Democrats that Trump's unpopularity will likely repair most of the problems the Democrats have going into the midterms. Why do I think that? Because it's happened so many other times, right? Right. The great, what fixes the political party's problems? The overreach of the party in power, right? But there's a part of me that wonders if the brand is unrecoverable for longer than an election cycle. What does that world look like? And do we even have the infrastructure in our politics? I mean, this is what I think there is a majority coalition that wants an alternative to Trumpism. But if there's no vehicle to build it or elect it, we could be under minority rule for quite some time. And I guess that's what I think that's where we might be trapped in this
Yeah, I
duopoly
think
in a
it's the
way that,
chicken or the egg question.
but
What comes first?
I do believe access, opening access to more candidates and more parties has to be the priority. I do believe that, because that will, I know those vacuums are going to get filled. There are a million Dan Osborns ready to run. That I know that. So I think the fight has to be for ballot access and to stop the two parties from essentially creating poll taxes on non-members of their parties to get access to democracy.
Yeah,
Mhm.
good point. I want to go to David Ocklander in Montana, who has a question about what stories the reform movement should be telling to different voters. Go ahead, David.
Thanks for the opportunity. Mr. Todd, my specific question is, I think we need to look at the audiences as different and needing to hear different stories. I live in Montana. How do we convince Republicans in a heavily dominated Republican state election reform is important? How do you convince someone in New York who's a Democrat that election reform is really important, when those central committees for each of the parties is going to really resist? What is that specific story that's going to motivate a voter to really get engaged and want to educate themselves?
Well, coming from Montana, I would say, let's teach them about the corporate copper movement and how I mean, you know, Montana is one of these states that used to be, I think still is, there's a higher bar or a lower tolerance for political shenanigans. I'm not saying it's not back, but there was a really strong bipartisan coalition, for instance, against dark money in Montana, that I didn't see pop up anywhere. And part of that is historic. I really feel like in sort of, if you have a memory of sort of how essentially big land folks came in and just sort of, took advantage of weak political structures in order to enrich themselves and take land away from people. I think I say that I just picked out Montana because you said you were from there. Look, I think I think the issue in general is we don't talk enough about solving problems. We instead look at things based on what will cause political pain for a political opponent. So instead of saying, all right, why we need political reform, because to solve this problem, the Democrats have had power these 3 times. They couldn't solve it. The Republicans had full control of Congress and the White House. They refused to solve it. This can't be solved under this, whether it's immigration. I think that's a classic case where you're just not solving this problem with one party control. But look, you're not, you asked for an individual issue, and I wish there was one that was easy to say. I mean, I think unfortunately it does take a second beat of explanation. Why do we need political reform? Because the current system isn't solving the hardest problems. Have to be solved in a bipartisan way or a tripartisan way. And unless you have a political infrastructure that encourages that rather than discourages it, you're not going to get there. You brought up the role of these state central committees. Man, if people knew how radical these state central committees were, Bernie Sanders supporters and Ron Paul supporters took over these state central committees all over the country in the mid-teens. And the Paul people became super Trumpy. It's why Rand Paul has a little bitterness in him every once in a while, because he was, if there's no Donald Trump, Rand Paul wins that nomination. I will really, in the alternative universe, because he was the outsider with some establishment cred that was making the same argument. It's that Trump was crazier at it, right? And was more entertaining. And the first supporters he took in that primary were the Paul people. They were the first ones to leave. And then, of course, he built his coalition from there. But, and then the Bernie crowd, the progressives, I've always said part of the problem the Democrats have these days is that their leaders and strategists are to the left of their average primary voter. And one of the advantages Republicans have today is their strategists and leaders are to the left of their primary voters.
Right.
And so that allows Republicans to at least, strategists to at least, they live with swing voters, so they know how to talk to swing voters. I don't know if I could say the same for the left these days. And I think that our Overton window is just sort of weirdly shifted. I wish there was one issue that was like, to me, it's usually corruption issues are the best way to convince people to change structure. And I think the more we show that, hey, both parties are captive of billionaires, and they are, right? To run for office now in the United States Senate, you got to have your own personal sugar mommy or sugar daddy, before a major party will even talk to you about running. That's a broken system.
I think also, just to chime in here too, I think something that we haven't made good enough use of in the primary reform movement is just the abysmal state of competition, that 50% of state legislators run unopposed in blue states, red states, purple states.
In Virginia, we had a battle for control. We were like a 2-seat difference,
Right.
and there were still 30 seats unopposed on each side. Like,
Right.
it was the craziest thing. There was like literally 10 seats. The same 10 seats were deciding control of our state assembly, and it's just ridiculous. That is not the way. It's funny you make it about competition. I also like, can you imagine going into a clothing store and and you only had 2 sizes to choose from, small and extra large?
Right.
What do all the voters that wear medium and schmediums and just large, where do they get their clothes in politics? I guess you got to go to a specialty store now. I don't know.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up related to this? And it's
go
just
ahead.
about voter apathy. Because I think it's directly connected to this question. How do you engage with stories to these different audiences when there's so much voter apathy, even in an environment when you have these kinds of issues that you're talking about, corruption, et cetera, et cetera? As a journalist, where do you stick your finger on the pulse?
It's funny you say that. Look, there's a lot of news avoiders right now, right? There's a lot of people that have tuned out for one reason or another. They just don't want it. They're tired of the stress that social media politics gives them. So I get that. I think this is a little bit of an issue, but there's a part of me that is worried that we've had our highest voter turnouts during the Trump era. What does that say about us? Is it because he's offering something that the two parties didn't offer before? And so there's a whole slew of voters. He has brought out voters that we've not seen participate before.
True.
So I could argue it's simply because he's offered a choice that those voters didn't think existed in the Republican Party. So I could argue that maybe you need to flip that on its head and say, look, you want to solve voter apathy, give them somebody to support. Is it possible that we're just not offering up enough choices? And look, before the Trump era, the highest voter turnout that I had ever had in an election I participated in was 1992. And what was unique about 92?
Ross Perot.
Right. And by the way, it was the highest youth turnout that time for I think a 10-year period. It did engage people. I guess I think that I would say is you guys are already onto it, right?
Yeah.
More choices on the ballot will bring more people to the election store. Okay, right? If you're selling more products, if you're offering up not just a small Democratic product or a small Republican product, but also this shade and this shade and this shade, well, more people may show up to the democracy store to make a choice.
Hey, I think you just gave us an idea for a new website, the Democracy Store. I think we ought to run with that. The interesting thing about Perot, Chuck, which this has gotten so little coverage. When was the last time we balanced a budget as a country? 2 years after Ross Perot ran, he didn't win. He didn't get a single electoral vote, and he totally shaped the agenda for Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich.
If I could make a pitch to people on this call, the folks on this call are on here because you care more than the average bear about the direction of this country. I want to reemphasize the point you just made there, which is how a failed independent candidacy can actually reform both parties. What else did Ross Perot do? He made the Republican Party rethink its position on trade. And whether it's, look, I've got strong feelings on tariffs and what they're doing to our economy, but let me set that aside. Okay. I know not everybody agrees, probably even on this call. But the fact of the matter is there was a single Republican orthodoxy on trade, and Ross Perot got the party to start to think another way, right? So he got the Democrats to think about balancing a budget, and he got Bill Clinton to start talking about a balanced budget, and he got Republicans to start thinking about, maybe labor unions are onto something here with some of their concerns about these trade agreements and what they do and workers' rights. Now, it took a generation. What's interesting is that think about what Repo did in 92, and arguably both parties ended up almost switching places on the trade issue.
It's fascinating.
But it sort of began with, the point is that as an independent candidate, you may fail to win the election, but if you're successful enough, you change how both parties behave. And for the Perot supporters in 92, my guess is many of them think, well, they might not think both parties listen, but they might have said, well, one party listened, and they gravitated toward that party.
All right, I want to go to Dr. Jessie Fields for the last question. She has a question about the relationship between the rise of independence and policy failure. Go ahead, Dr. Fields.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Chuck, Todd, Mr. Todd, for being here
Yes.
with us. My question, I'm a medical doctor and a community organizer. I live in New York City. And my question is about structural reform and democracy and social policy. I know we don't have a lot of time left. I think that there's a lack of trust because the two-party system has been corrupt, and it has also failed, as you pointed out, in terms of public policy. There's rising poverty, homelessness, there's a mental health crisis throughout our country, on and on and on. So the failure, I think, breeds distrust, the corruption of the two parties, the fact that they have such control. And so my question is about the relationship of structural reform, which I agree with what you were saying. If we could reform the structure, and also the issue of local control, people at the local level, not just a right, a left, and a moderate solution, but a solution coming from grassroots people, from people who've been organizing and advocates about health, about education, and so forth in communities. They have a lot to offer. There's a lot of innovative ways to deal with problems in the medical system, in healthcare, and mental health that never make it to the electeds, to policy moves. So I think there's a lot there in terms of that relationship, more democracy for more grassroots control, taking the control out of the political parties, out of the hands of the political parties, which I think breeds distrust, and there's a lot of corruption in those policies that they come up with.
Look, I think you want to get at an 80% whole question agreement on. It's simply saying, is a two-party system been good for America or bad for America? And I have a feeling, and I think, so when you guys are looking for more, when I think about ways, how do we get more people thinking about reform? As sort of, we could sit here, it turns out you can send I always say that Congress is sort of like, we all think our individual member of Congress, when we meet them, is a very loyal, it's sort of like the way I used to treat a member of Congress the way I would a Labrador, right? Individually, you can train a lab to sit. You can train a lab to scratch at the door when it has to go. But when a lab gets together with 434 other labs, they don't listen to their owner anymore. They just bark, 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 bark at each other, right? And so I think it's proof to me that the system itself is what corrupts these members. I really think 95% of people come here for the right motivations. I really believe that. Maybe it's 90% now. Okay. Maybe there's a lot more that are trying to get rich quick or become, we're also known as Hollywood for ugly people. So I do worry that some people now run for office because it's a chance to become a low-grade celebrity, and maybe they too can get a Cameo account. But I do think that figuring out how to get more public opinion researchers to test. I don't think the public has a lot of satisfaction in the two-party system. And I don't think we poll this question enough. And if this is one of those things, you're looking for ways to get the mainstream media to talk about this issue more,
Right.
getting more of these pollsters to ask about confidence in the two-party system. Is it representative of, do the two parties represent everybody in America well or not well, stuff like that. I think the more that the public is aware, the more people in the press are aware, and how much, there was all this focus on how unpopular the Democrats were. Well, the Republicans are not popular. They're just less unpopular than the Democrats are right now. We don't like either party.
Right.
And it's not by a little, it's by a lot, which means we don't really like either party because we don't feel like it represents us very well. So I to shift the conversation, I look what happened in Greenland. A third and fourth parties finished first and second. The fact that we don't have a system where that could happen in America means our democracy isn't working as well as it could.
Well said.
And that's something we need to strive for.
Chuck, thank you. Thank you, all of you, for joining in. Chuck, that was great. What's
Enjoyed
next for you? Are you relaunching the Chuck Toddcast?
I am. That'll start in a couple weeks.
Okay.
I think I even have my first guest booked. I don't want to say just yet, but it's a good one. Somebody who's been willing to buck their party, and I'll just leave it at that. I am looking for political disruptors to feature. If look, I always say my North Star is I cover politics as it is, not as I wish it were. But the beauty of the podcast is I want to make it a home for disruptors to be able to say, hey, here's a better idea to chew on, because we don't, the Sunday shows aren't the place for that anymore. And I wish it were, but they're just not. This is not an indictment on that. It's sort of just what's happened. I think those are 30-minute conversations, and we don't have 30-minute conversations on TV anywhere. Okay. And that's why in some ways the podcast and the YouTube and the Zoom formats I think people are starting to gravitate more to them, because we can have the nuanced conversation, particularly if it's a specialized conversation like the
it's
one
not just sound bites, and people are done with that. Well, thank you for coming on. Thank all of you. Hey, one final announcement here.
Hey, you can go to thechucktoddcast.com.
Okay.
And sign up, and then you'll get an alert the minute I'm live.
thechucktoddcast.com. Again,
just like the George Washington University and the Ohio State University. Don't forget the the.
That's right. The is important. Open primaries. We have some great guests coming up in the future on our virtual discussion series, the Primary Buzz. We've also just kicked off our 2025 annual campaign. So all of you will be getting phone calls and emails asking you to pony up and invest in the growth of this movement. Please give much more than you can afford. We need it. We're growing. Thank you again, Chuck. Thank you all for joining. And we'll send out a video of this in the next 48 hours. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.